fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 30, Sibling Revivalry. A flicker of red illuminated the dark, then another, and another, until reality itself split apart in a thunderstorm of swirling hues and lightning. Eric stumbled out of the warbling vortex, collapsing to his knees, then his side in convulsions of pain. There was no soft grass to catch him this time, no bird song to welcome him home, no deep sigh of dense forest air to comfort him. Only a bed of broken concrete and debris. He coughed, sucking down dust as he struggled to breathe. His chest, lungs, heart, bones were racked with a pain he could only equate to someone shoving their fist through his body. His soul was shredded, being pulled from what was surely a gaping wound. His fingers tore at the ruined ground beneath him, blood seeping from between his clenched teeth. When the portal finally shuttered closed, Eric managed to turn his head to the side, unable to lift his body, and vomited, saving himself from drowning in his own sick. He curled in on himself, twitching and spasming until the ghosts of the red lights faded from his vision. He blinked watering eyes as he stared on in horror at the black of his hands seeping further down his wrist. The device that Artemis had sent him, a small, handheld thing, had somehow done what only the divine or wraith could, bridge his shade. But unlike the other times he had traveled back, assisted or otherwise, this felt forced, rough, like cracking a walnut with a jackhammer. It was going to get the job done, but what was left could hardly be worth saving. As the pain eased away, his body relaxed, and Eric was able to drag the back of his wrist across his mouth before pushing himself up to his hands and knees. He scoured the dirt nearby for his dropped glasses, finding them and pushing them back up his nose. In that moment, his wits returned to him, and his senses clicked into place. The caustic smell of gunpowder and ozone filled his nostrils, forcing him to his feet. He looked around, but surrounded by the pitch of midnight, he struggled to make out anything. Something orange flared across the sky, and he caught a glimpse of destroyed buildings. Skeletal structures lined what was once a street, now half buried beneath the rubble of concrete and rebar. The ground shook as the missile made impact somewhere in the dark. Following the explosion, a bellowing cacophony of shattering brick and stone shook the air. And then the screams started. Oh, God. No, 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 no! Eric scoured the ground for Artemis's dropped device, the words, "I need to leave," playing on repeat in his mind. He pulled it from the dust, gripped either end of the handheld machine to complete the connection, and slammed down on the button, heedless of the hell he had just endured. He'd travel 1,000, 1,000,000 more times like that just to get away from here. No red lightning appeared around his being, or floated in midair above him. No sickening tug of hasty shade-stitching threatened to empty his stomach. Nothing. He pressed it again. Nothing happened. Over and over, he slammed his thumb against the button, each time harder than the last. No, not here. Why? Why would you take me here? The rapid-fire sounds of heavy artillery responding to the missile attack came next, forcing him into action with a short scream of surprise. He ducked behind the broken remnant of a hotel sign, attempting to soothe his heart rate. The disciplined staccato of military boots marching on the next street over reverberated out in the silence of this area, followed by shouts and commands, then the unmistakable rumble of tank treads crushing debris to dust in its wake, all of it heading this way. Of all the places his subconscious decided to send him, this was the absolute worst one possible. Eric swallowed that lump in his throat and peeked his head out from behind the sign. This world was caught in the midst of an endless war. The skies choked gray with acrid pollution, innocent casualties lining the streets beneath white blankets, and the faces of those unlucky enough to survive loomed like specters, haunting him still. He pressed the button again and again, refusing to let himself think of the real reason he was so desperate to leave. As the sky was illuminated by another missile, the orange glow washing his surroundings with a false warmth, he saw the familiar shape of a half-obliterated urgent care center. The entry had taken the brunt of the attack, the remains of the large red medical cross the only part recognizable. The lights inside were dark, and most of the cars and ambulances in the parking lot had been blasted into an accidental barricade. The deafening sounds of firefight drew closer, and as the light from the missile faded, Eric made the decision not to wait around for them. He took off at a run for the building, his long legs carrying him across the uneven and chaos-strewn earth until his feet hit asphalt and he dove behind an upturned SUV. The marching rhythm of boots played a sinister melody against the backdrop of explosions, and he knew any moment now they would breach this road and set upon anything that moved. He couldn't wait for another missile to light his path. Squinting in the dark, using what little light there was from the distant fires, he dodged sinkholes, sprang fire hydrants, and down power lines to find shelter behind the open doors of an abandoned ambulance. He flung himself inside, pulling the door shut. A momentary relief spread through him, and he let out a trembling sigh. Then he heard shouted commands just on the other side of the parking lot.
"You lot, check that group of buildings over there. You, check the hospital and all the vehicles. Every door, every cupboard, every nook and cranny. A drink on me for every bullet spent today, boys."
There was a snap of compliance and the scurry of boots. Eric's heart hammered in his throat as he pulled a discarded sheet off the gurney and backed into a corner. He heard shuffling headed his way, and, twisting, he could see out of the door's side-view mirrors. 2 soldiers, donned in immaculate white and navy uniforms, picked their way across the parking lot. Bright lamps on the helmets illuminated the way, and one carried an assault rifle, while the other wore a mobile exoskeleton, a high-caliber artillery weapon mounted on its shoulder. They broke every window on each car they passed as they made their way toward the hospital. There was a scream shortly before a rapid hail of bullets returned the night to silence. Eric scrunched back down into his space, covering himself with a sheet, and clamped his hand over his mouth, his attempt to calm his panicked breathing. Smash! 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 Shattered glass rang out closer and closer as the 2 soldiers closed in on Eric's hiding spot. He had just managed to adjust himself behind the gurney and a broken defibrillator when the doors to the back of the ambulance were ripped free, and a blinding light swept through the compartment. With a grunt, the soldier turned away.
There's no power to this block. What's the lieutenant thinking? This was one of the first areas to be hit. It's a junkyard now. It's gonna be a waste of our time. Don't make a sound. Don't breathe. Be calm.
Eric repeated this over and over in his mind, his hand still clamped tight on his mouth, his eyes watering as he waited. The exoskeleton of the second soldier whined as he stomped towards the next vehicle.
"We have our orders. Let's just do them."
There was another response of shattering glass, and then a long sigh.
"You ever think about abandoning this cause, Lucky?" "Shut your yap unless you want to get reported."
Then a long pause.
"But yeah, every day, Digger. Every day."
The 2 soldiers, finding nothing to keep their interests, stomped off around the building, leaving Eric to clutch at his chest with one hand and suck in deep breaths through the other. Eventually, he heard commanding shouts for the platoon to move out, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. He waited for the suffocating silence to return, before he slid out of his hiding spot and darted across the open 20 feet of unprotected parking lot to slip inside the collapsed entryway of the urgent care center. Protected from the elements, Eric felt his way along the hall to the stairwell and began descending into the basement. The soldiers were right that this place was a junkyard, picked over and emptied before the bombs fell, but he knew this building had a working generator. After a series of wrong turns in the pitch black, he eventually found what he had been looking for. His hands moved for the emergency box switch and hauled down on the giant lever. Following the steady rumble of the machine initializing, a light flickered to life above him, illuminating the all-too-familiar room. He had been down here so many times before, refilling the fuel tanks with whatever he could scrounge. With a heavy sigh, Eric moved for the maintenance room across the way, where he knew the tools for the upkeep of this place had been kept. He slapped Artemis's device down on the workbench and, turning it over, unscrewed the panel on the back. He numbly popped off the covering and peered inside at the inner workings of the device. He'd expected to be at a loss. The necromancer's craft was foreign to him after all, but instead he recognized the design. Eric silently thanked Artemis for having been so thorough in his letters. Now he wouldn't have to reverse engineer anything. Another rumble of explosion shook the ground, this one closer, and a stream of dust cascaded down around him. The lights flickered in response, but he paid it no mind. This place was safe, at least for now. Once he began poking around the guts of the machine, it only took half a second for him to find the issue. A small, rare element power core fed the bioconductor array, but the output wasn't strong enough. This forced the device to draw power from the next ready source, himself. The resulting surge had fried some of the minor connections, which were an easy fix and not the real problem. He eyed his blackened fingers and realized just how lucky he'd been the device had overloaded when it did and prevented his second jump. He could have died if it had succeeded. Okay, so, solutions. From what he could tell, he had to either replace the array with a more efficient one, something that was so specialized and rare he'd have a better chance at winning the lottery than finding it, or replace the power core with something stronger while keeping it small enough to be portable. Dragging his blackened hands down his face, Eric released a long, drawn-out sigh. That meant braving the war zone outside, and hope beyond hope that he had Lady Luck with him. But a voice cried out in the darkness, shattering his thoughts and plans. He froze when he heard it again, his heart climbing into his throat.
No, just ignore it. You know what it is. No need to check. Just stay down here where it's dark and leave when it's over.
But there was no reasoning with him at this point. The manic part of him, the one that couldn't leave anything half-finished, dragged his feet into motion, and one by one, he climbed the darkened steps until he crouched near the top, hidden in the stairwell. Illuminated by another distant explosion, orange light danced across the face of a distraught young man, freshly stripped of youthful delusions of immortality. Eric watched his younger self struggle to haul in a battered, screaming man through the gap in the crushed wall of the hospital.
Hold on. Just hold on for a little bit longer. I need to find a place to set you down.
Hearing his own voice come from outside his body had been unsettling the first time, but now Eric barely recognized his younger self. He was frantic, panicky, and the warble in his voice spoke of tears.
Just hold on. I'll fix you, and then we'll go back home to Mom, okay?
But Vel's screams never stopped. Barely alive, burned and shattered, he protested each step taken. In the shadows, eyes wide with fear, Eric backed away with a shuddering breath. He couldn't stay, he thought with a shake of his head. He couldn't be there when his brother began begging for death, which wouldn't be long now. His uneasy stomach churned and rumbled. He needed to leave. He didn't want to be here for this. He couldn't listen to this. Not again. But as his mind spiraled back to the two pieces of his device and his escape, An acid weight sunk into his gut with realization. The components he needed to fix the machine were here. He slumped back against the wall, closing his eyes. He'd have to wait for his past self to depart before he could secure what he needed, assuming he could gather the strength to bring himself to do so. The pink light of dawn brought a hush across the battlefield. In those 6 hours, barricaded in a restroom down the hall from his brother, Eric hadn't slept a wink. He was too afraid to relax, too afraid of being discovered, too afraid of facing a god, and too afraid of reliving the horrors that brought him to where he was now. But his past self had clearly done something right. Those screams had stopped before morning broke, and now only the manic, one-sided conversation echoed out through the empty halls. Eric reached up and cracked open the bathroom door, just an inch, so he could catch every word.
Okay.
The rapid footsteps of pacing could be heard.
I found enough morphine in here to keep you comfortable for about a day.
There was a clatter of supplies, a slew of curses, and then the quick shuffle of silence.
Just sit tight. I have to go get a few supplies that are only going to be found in the larger hospitals.
Another pause.
I'll be careful. Shouldn't take more than a few hours, maybe half a day. Please, don't die on me, okay?
Eric remembered the pleading tone of his own voice as he begged his brother to remain alive long enough for him to save the man. And that memory came with the haunting look on Vel's face that made his stomach churn, and churn, and churn. But he froze when those footsteps grew loud, slipping past his hiding spot and out into the open area of the hospital. He peered through the gap in the door in time to see his past self duck out into the quiet of the morning. Idiot! It wouldn't take long for him to realize that night was the only safe time to travel in this apocalyptic hellscape, but history proved he'd survive regardless. He waited several minutes before climbing to his feet, giving his stiff joints a satisfying snap. Eric caught sight of himself in the mirror and paused. Regret and fear had worn purple trenches under his eyes, and he sighed. He splashed his face with the gurgling cold water that sluggishly spewed from the tap. He scrubbed at his eyes, his beard, his hair, until he felt fractionally more human. Then he fixed his shirt, pressing flat a wrinkle here and brushing away the dirt there. He was stalling.
It's time. Time to fix your machine and leave this place.
With a slow exhale, he forced himself to step out of the restroom. A strange quiet permeated the hospital, silent as the grave, but he was an intruder in a mausoleum, walking among the dead. Only where there should have been crypts and coffins, there were abandoned gurneys and overturned beds among the rubble. He quietly followed the trail of smeared blood on the floor. Not that he needed it, he knew where he was going. Until he came to a stop outside a door labeled Examination Room 14. He hesitated for a breath, his fingers shaking as he reached for the knob.
Focus! You need to fix your device, and the sooner you do that, the sooner you can leave. Then none of this will matter.
He swallowed hard and pushed his way inside. He had never come to terms with what had transpired here, choosing instead to repress it. The pungent odor of iron in the air slammed into him, forcing him to face what he had long sought to forget. The room was filled with gently humming devices and the broken sounds from his brother. Vel was laying on his left side, his body practically mummified with blood-stained gauze, melted and blistered skin peeking through the gaps, and only a stump remained of his right arm, just a mound of shredded muscle and torn skin where the shoulder met the chest. The machine beeped a steady song as it pumped drugs into his system. Eric swallowed again, his mouth dry as dust, and forced himself to look away.
Go back and stop this from happening. Then it won't be real. Just a bad memory of something that never happened.
He knew the components he needed were here because he had used them to rebuild his brother. The bioconductor array was an integral part of interfacing one's body with technology, essentially translating analog and digital signals between the two, be it connecting to one's shade or an artificial limb. And his younger self had managed to find a power source, a small, working Casimir engine, a quantum energy supply that, theoretically, would never run out. He licked his lips nervously. In this reality, hospitals and emergency centers were equipped with machines that had such quantum power cells, backup generators that would kick in should the power fail to keep life support going. Most of the high-end equipment had already been trucked out of this location long before the building had been hit, but a scant few machines had been left behind. Eric didn't know why. Maybe they had forgotten them, or maybe they were attacked before they were finished. Whatever the cause, a single remaining ventilator sat alone in the corner. Without thinking, he moved for it. Pulling open the access panel at its side, he stared at the mess of wires and cables strung in a web of perfect electrical functions. Something whirred inside an enclosed space, creating a soft warmth and gentle hum. That was what he needed, and he frowned, hating where the trail of his own thoughts were headed.
Eric.
The voice that rasped out his name was hardly recognizable as Vel's, but he turned anyway to see green eyes staring at him through a half-lidded gaze of pain and sedation. Any day now, his younger self would replace one of them with the core of his AI system. The entire process would take over a month to complete as his younger self scrounged for scrap to mold into his brother's new body.
You're back.
Vel pried each word from his throat with effort, agony clogging his lungs. He wheezed, sucking down a deep breath, but choked on the remaining letters in his mouth.
Where? What?
Eric could see the questions forming as memories of the prior night broke through his brother's drug-fueled stupor. The haze of smoke, gunfire, and explosions. How their brief trip to find their dad had landed them in the middle of a warring country, he still didn't know. This place wasn't supposed to be here. The portal wasn't supposed to take them here. Mel found his answer in the silence, and the horror broke him, tears spilling free. Fighting off every instinct, every nerve in his body that screamed at him to resist, Eric reached out and placed a hand on his brother's head. Vel was crying. A jarring sight to see because, well, he hardly remembered this man. He only knew the grizzled, jaded, and broken person he had crafted in his brother's place, the one that never cried, someone that never showed emotions at all, erecting walls to protect himself from ever becoming this again. He sighed and dialed up the IV drip slightly, helping to calm the man. He rolled over a stool from across the room, coming to a stop in front of his brother before taking a seat. There was no rush. His past self would be gone for most of the day, and Eric knew he needn't worry about preserving the timeline. High on morphine, Vel would never remember any of this. And to be honest, he owed him this much. A pained smile crept across his face as he stared down at his brother.
Yeah, I'm back.
Confusion fogged what little clarity Vel had left in his brain. The man sitting before him looked nothing like the sibling that had left some time ago. A thick, bushy beard had taken over the lower half of his face. Gray streaked through his hair, and age lines crinkled at the edges of his eyes and across his forehead. A memory pulled itself from the sludge of his thoughts, and he let out a laugh that was nothing more than a wheeze.
You look like...
Words were so hard.
Bigfoot.
Reminded of that moment, Eric's pained smile warmed.
Yeah. Sorry about your wrist.
He took Vel's open hand in his, clasping his fingers around it. The two of them never had a brotherly relationship. They moved in different circles, one a dreamer and one a thinker, a fact highlighted by this very moment. Vel tried to reach out, only to gasp in pain as the stump pulled against the fresh wound, and his eyes moved to it. He let out a low moan that moved into a keening whimper.
Hey.
Eric stroked his brother's hair.
It's going to be okay. I can't feel my legs.
Vel wheezed, tears blurring the vision of his brother.
How is it okay? What kind of life can I live like this?
A question Vel would come to ask him again and again, one that never hit Eric as hard as it did right now. In his naivety, he thought he was saving his brother's life, but the man only ever threw those words in his face.
What kind of life can I live like this?
To which Eric, indignant, would reply,
I never asked you to come with me.
But he knew the truth now. He had convinced his mother to beg Vel to follow him. It was his fault. All of it. And he had fixed his brother the same way he had fixed everything else, by making it worse. Eric cinched his fingers tight around Vel's.
What kind of life?
Before, he'd never had an answer. But he recalled the last things his brother had said to him before this whole quest of his started.
I finally made something with this broken life you gave me. You're going to be amazing.
Emotions wore Eric's voice raw, and he blinked hard.
You'll have a full life, with all those adventures you've always wanted, and you're going to meet all sorts of people. You'll topple tyrants, lead armies, save the world.
He pawed at the tracks of tears on his face with his free hand.
And even find people you love, people you'll live for, family.
Even if he wasn't one of them. The sparkle that lit up in his brother's eyes spoke of the unasked question, and Eric shook his head slightly. He squeezed Vel's hand, firm with promise.
I'll get you back to Lucas, somehow.
In the same breath it had been born in, that glimmer of hope died, and he cursed under his breath.
I promised you, years ago, that I'd take care of you. I failed at that when Dad left, when college happened, when life got in the way, but...
A monitor stuttered.
Listen to me, Vel. I'm working on keeping that promise. I'm just...
an idiot.
Not always smart enough.
Why was he even doing this to himself? Just take the power supply, go back in time, and set things how they were always supposed to be. Except his past self would need that to save Vel's life, to power all of his autonomous systems. He shook his head. Clearly the lack of sleep was unsettling him. If he stopped this reality from happening, none of it mattered. Vel would never need the power supply, never become a cranky old cyborg, and never go on all those adventures. His brother's words slammed into him again, harder this time.
I will not let you take it away to assuage your guilt.
Was that what he was doing? No, of course not. Something ticked in his brother's breathing, and the monitor began to alarm rapidly. Vel was flatlining.
Oh God. Okay,
This wasn't supposed to happen. His brother had been fine when he got back that first day. But the machine wasn't lying, as Vel's eyes rolled back. His CPR lessons came back to him in a flash, and he hardly hesitated to lay his brother on his back and leapt into chest compressions. Over and over again, he did this until the monitor stuttered back to life. But Eric watched on in horror as Vel's lips became blue despite the steady heart rate.
What?
Then his stomach dropped, and he froze. In his haste to save his brother's life, he failed to remember why he was on his side. The injury Vel had sustained saving his life. A large shard of shrapnel embedded in his spine. Eric had just forced it deeper, severing the spinal cord and completely paralyzing his brother. His eyes darted quickly to the ventilator in the corner. His ticket out of this place, away from these trials and his freedom from the gods. When he marched into this room, he was so full of confidence and absolute on his plan.
Get what you need and get out. Whatever happened, happened.
But as he stood there, watching his siblings suffocate, he realized, when faced with the opportunity to regain his old life, Vel had chosen this broken existence instead. Did Eric have any right to take that away?
Change is scary, but gives us space for something new to take hold.
Acting swiftly, Eric reached for the machine. He pushed it towards the bed, trying his best to ignore the angry beeping of the other devices around him. Barely registering how his hands worked without his mind, he gathered what he needed. A cut here, a tube inserted there, and after a harrowing few minutes, and with an absolute truckload of luck, he had managed to get the machine to breathe for his brother. Panting, he stumbled back onto that little stool, and Eric clutched at the ends of his hair with bloody fingers. The steady rhythm of the heart rate monitor told him he had succeeded in saving Vel's life. He wasn't supposed to need that machine for another day. Not until his past self tried to remove the shrapnel and caused the exact same injury. All that effort, and he'd put reality right back on the same track as before. He couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't live his life making choices for everyone else or dodging gods and fighting to fix every mistake he'd ever made, only to make things worse or have no effect on them at all. He pulled Artemis's device back into his hands. Eric had made his decision, his back slumping with the weight of it. Mournfully, he stared down into the open panel of the thing, and a small smile crept into the corners of his mouth. He now knew why it had looked so familiar to him before. His past self had found something oddly similar and used the bioconductor array as the basis for Vel's prosthetic arm. He shifted his attention over to his brother, whose eyes tracked him slowly, the only thing he could move. Eric stood, placing his hand once again in Vel's.
Don't give up.
He gestured over his shoulder with a nod.
That idiot is going to need you to keep him alive, and he's going to be a whiny, thankless ass about it. But don't give up. It'll be worth it. Trust me.
He pulled his hand away, fingers slipping past fingers as he made his way across the room. Eric set the device down in a spot he knew his past self would find it. Funny how time travel worked like that. paradox upon paradox. He wished he'd never had the stupid idea to try and fix things in the first place. He walked to the edge of the room and stopped, falling to his knees.
Kadaini.
His voice was tiny, his heart just as exhausted as his mind and body.
Kadaini, please. I can't do this anymore. I can't. Just take me away from here. Please.
He'd never prayed before, so Eric couldn't be sure if he was doing it right. But as red lightning crackled to life around him, he knew the deity had heard his plea. He cast one last look at his brother, tears leaking from his own eyes as he watched them fall from Vel's. A sad smile crested his face, and he nodded.
Thank you for everything you'll do, for everything you'll become.
Something grabbed hard on his shade, and he was yanked from that world into the blissful silence of darkness. You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description. Don't be such a baby. It's just turbulence. I mean, typically only about 2,000 planes crash every year, so the odds of...
Eric, stop teasing your brother. Can't you see he's scared?
I'm sorry. Hey, take my hand. It's gonna be okay. I'll take care of you. I promise.